Well, what a week it has been. Let's start with the latest from the House of Commons. Today, MPs did not sit to debate emergency measures because of the police operations underway to quell protesters and get them out of a secured area around Parliament. MPs were told today anyone not in the Parliament precinct should stay away from the core until further notice.
And this as last night, police enforcement finally got underway 3 weeks after the protest turned occupation began. Here tonight to discuss all this is our political panel, Tom Mulcair, former federal NDP leader, conservative strategist Jamie Ellerton, and Seamus Murphy, a Liberal strategist with Council Public Affairs. Thank you all so much. Tom, I'll start with you. You're right underneath me here on the screen. So what happens now with this debate on the emergency legislation now that today MPs did not have a chance to debate it, and it is already being used, this legislation?
Well, it is allowed to be used. I mean, the formality of getting it through Parliament, of course, is important, but it's provided for in the legislation that they can start enforcing it right away. And then they have a certain amount of time to have this rush debate. Losing Friday is not the best situation, but given what we're going through, obviously they had no choice. I think that the police are to be congratulated. I find it galling that so many women and men in that line have had to be brought in from throughout Ontario, and indeed the Sûreté du Québec, the Quebec provincial police there as well, simply because this situation has been allowed to fester, both by the city of Ottawa, whose mayor has come up with his own rules. He actually invited people up on to Wellington, as incredible as that might seem. They had to sack their police chief in the middle of this because he was completely unable to control the situation. And now Mr. Trudeau has finally come back into the game. Last Monday, he announced the Emergency Measures Act, but he hadn't been seen or heard from in almost 10 days. So it's a terrible situation that we've all been going through, but I do think that the police who are on that front line today deserve a tip of the hat from all Canadians because they've been doing a very professional job. Nothing's gotten out of hand. They're taking a strong approach, but they're going to take the time that's necessary, and let's hope that it continues the way it's been going with a minimum of injury, and you know the whole thing is rolled up as quickly as possible, but as cleanly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, that's the goal for police as well. Seamus, I want to bring you in because, to Tom's point, the Prime Minister has not been front and center today. He was not with his ministers in speaking to the media either. He kind of passed the buck to the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who expressed that today was a day of great sorrow for this country, saying that this was painful to her, that this is happening in Canada, and painful for a lot of Canadians to watch. I guess what's at stake here for the Prime Minister, for the governing Liberals, to make sure that this is resolved as peacefully as possible?
Well, I can tell you, here in Ottawa, there's a great sense of relief today that we're finally seeing what has been a nightmare for this city start to come to some resolution. What people in Ottawa have gone through has been horrible in terms of the harassment, the abuse, the racist taunts, the homophobia, and just the inability to move freely around our city. And I don't think anybody takes any pleasure in the fact that it has come to this. I mean, the extraordinary step of having to invoke the Emergencies Act was not anybody's first choice. But after 3 weeks, you know, people have finally said enough is enough. And unfortunately, the federal government felt they had to take that extraordinary step. Today, we've heard from the police to say that they have used the powers that have been given to them both provincially and federally to take the action that we see in the streets of Ottawa today, setting up a red zone around all of Ottawa's downtown to clear out a group of people who've been warned many times, pleaded with to leave peacefully. And instead, what we've seen is, unfortunately, incidents of violence on our streets today. So, the Prime Minister has been out to make the case around the need for the Emergencies Act. He was front and center in terms of presenting the government's arguments in the House of Commons on that. I'm sure we haven't heard the last from him, as this will continue to be debated over the coming days. But my hope is that soon we won't need these powers anymore, that this moment will pass, and that we can get back to restoring order in this city.
Jamie, I want to bring you in. I want to share with you a tweet posted at 5 o'clock from interim Conservative leader Candice Bergen. She says, "I am disturbed and saddened by what we are seeing in Ottawa. The situation was created by the PM and his desire to divide Canadians. It's time for MPs to return to the House tomorrow to stop the overreach by this government and restore unity, wholeness, and hope back to our nation. Now, some of the replies, of course, they will be partisan in terms of Liberal or NDP replies, but people are saying, this is your fault. You said there were good people on both sides. There is, of course, images and support from Conservatives for this group. What do you make of that from a Conservative perspective? Was that a wise comment from the interim leader?
I think what you saw from Candace Bergen was continue to speak to a political constituency that Conservatives have been talking throughout this process. And a lot of it goes back to when the election started last fall. Conservatives asked Justin Trudeau to essentially tone down the rhetoric and not be so divisive in forcing mandates while continuing to push the benefits of vaccines to all Canadians through education and persuasion. Justin Trudeau didn't take that approach, and he really stoked the flames of division from the get-go on this. I think if you look from a policing standpoint, Christina, it felt like officialdom in Canada didn't really take this seriously until the Ambassador Bridge got shut down. And then it took the better part of the week for the Windsor Police to coordinate with other agencies across the province to get support from the London Police, the Chatham-Kent Police, the OPP and the RCMP to ultimately clear the protests there and move the bridge. And it seems like everyone forgot that Ottawa is actually still part of Ontario. And the federal government, and Justin Trudeau specifically as the Prime Minister, was starting to get heat for not doing anything to actually alleviate and tone down the rhetoric, bring the temperature lower, and ultimately try and find a quicker and peaceful resolution. Instead, went full nuclear by invoking the Emergencies Act. I think if you listen to what experts in policing have been saying all week, they really didn't need any of these powers. They already had them. They just needed the time to make up for the incompetence of the Ottawa police force in not doing their job from the get-go.
We have heard that from those in the policing community, from lawyers and political pundits such as yourself. And I'll come to you, Tom, as I know you're our NDP perspective here on the panel, but you're also the only former elected official here on the panel. I want to ask you about the consequences for those in leadership on behalf of all parties in terms of what we've seen over the last few weeks. Canadians will not forget what they've seen, no matter which party they're affiliated with, when it comes to election time. I mean, who is it that comes out as a winner and loser? Who disappointed you the most? Who is it that showed some resilience or some composure? What would you say?
I'd say it's going to take not a few days, but a few months for the dust to settle on this and for people to have a calm opinion. I think Jamie's making a good point. Prime Minister Trudeau used rhetoric, language early on that simply stoked the fires. It reminded me of Hillary Clinton's famous statement about Trump supporters being a basket of deplorables. They were homophobes. They were racists. They wore aluminum foil hats. They were afraid of being injected with microchips, all that sort of stuff. He kept piling on. He did the same thing in the House this week, looking at a Conservative member of Parliament who's a descendant of Holocaust survivors and inferring, and in fact talking about the fact, how can you support people who have swastikas? It was tone deaf from the Prime Minister, and it was totally inappropriate, and he should have apologized as she asked him to. But those are all distractions from the main thing, because what Jamie forgets is that Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, had to use his equivalent of the Emergencies Act. He had to use his special legislation to put in the harshest penalties to bring everything together, and that's what finally broke the back of the people who were trying to shut down commerce between Canada and the U.S. at the Ambassador Bridge. So Mr. Trudeau had no choice. I've heard that same argument from Conservatives all week. You should have done things differently. That's a fair game. That's what opposition parties say. But they never have an answer beyond that, because it's simply not true that you would have been able to bring in all of the forces that are there now. It's not true that you would have been able to use all of the techniques and the policing ability, shut down bank accounts, go after the foreign money that is financing an insurrection in our country. So that's not true. So the Emergencies Act was absolutely required. Mr. Trudeau did the right thing. Mr. Singh is backing Mr. Trudeau's Liberal government on this, and I think he's right to do so. I think that his angle, from what I've been able to understand so far, has a lot to do with all of the racist symbolism, the white supremacist angle to the people who are in a lot of these protests. And I think that that brought him to the same conclusion as Mr. Trudeau. We've got to find a quick, clean solution to this festering problem. It's so harmful to all of us, but it's very hurtful for all Canadians to see this.
Tom, I just want to follow up on something you said there, because what the interim police chief said today is he wouldn't be able to do what his force did and others did without this legislation, without the emergency legislation, but he didn't elaborate. And we've heard time and time again that there is legislation that exists or other ways that this enforcement could have been brought about without the Emergency Measures Act. In terms of what Jamie's saying, we've heard this from lawyers and those in policing. What is is it that that act has permitted those in government to do that couldn't have been done any other way?
Well, concentrating their minds on the fact that they're going to have their bank accounts frozen. They'll be charged with mischief. There's going to be massive arrests. They can proceed under the legislation, which has its own penalties. These are all things that have been added to the toolbox that the police already have. The same way Doug Ford needed his emergency legislation that existed provincially, he put those decrees, those orders in council into effect, massive penalties. He used everything that he had. Mr. Trudeau is simply using everything he has. It's pure rhetoric. I mean, I'm a lawyer. I've been in public law for over 40 years, but this is an easy argument. Oh, you could have done it differently. I never get an answer back from the Conservatives when they say that. What's your answer? What would you have done? And the answer is you should have been
I'm actually going to respond to that right now, if you don't mind, Christina.
Yeah,
the provincial order was much more focused in terms of what it was going after for the financial transactions piece of this. And the province of Ontario is massive. You could have mobilized police forces, including from here in Toronto, Peel, Durham, etc., to go and support the Ottawa police under leadership with OPP. There are no shortage of police officers here. The federal government stepped in effectively because people tried to treat Ottawa as if it's not part of the province of Ontario. And Justin Trudeau decided to go with a full nuclear option. There are a lot of people who have really grave concerns about how unilaterally shutting people out of the financial system without any recourse, and none of the financial institutions having any liability for doing so, for people to, if they were wronged by the system from this government overreach, and governments do wrong things all the time. So this really was an extraordinarily nuclear option, Christina. And to just say this was all about mobilizing a few extra police forces and it allowed them to do the job, I think is a gross oversimplification of the overreach of what this ultimately means for the Canadian state and its relationship with the citizens of Canada.
But if I may,
I'm not convinced.
If I may, for just
Go ahead, Seamus.
Seamus, let's have the Liberal strategist here. And one thing I wanted to point out is a criticism on behalf of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association is that this legislation is not targeted as it was meant to be. It's widespread across the country. And saying that, there was potential, there could have been, for protests to continue to pop up across the country. Was this necessary? Because Jamie's argument is that the Premier has the jurisdiction, of course, over Ontario, but beyond that.
Right. Well, we have a real problem here with foreign funding of illegal activity. In terms of some of the information that's become available, roughly half of the money that's flowed in to support these protests is coming from overseas. And the government simply did not have the tools to prevent that situation, which we have seen. We have seen the supplies, the financial resources flowing in to support the blockade at our borders here in Ottawa. And the beautiful the mechanism that's in the Emergencies Act that should give us some comfort is the fact that there will be a full inquiry into how these powers are being used. The officials who are enforcing these rules right now, because there are active investigations underway, because there is an active operation underway, they're not at liberty to provide the full light on the rationale for taking these steps. We have to place a degree of trust in our law enforcement officials. But rest assured, in time, we will learn more about where the funds are coming from and why the government took the decision that it did to try to stop the flow of money, which is at the root of a movement that has cut off large swaths of our economy and shut down major cities across the country.
Tom, so where does the Prime Minister go from here? Because while there will be an inquiry, this is something I'm sure we're going to be talking about for months to come. He's got to unify the country once again. He's got to bridge that divide, bring the fringe minority, so to speak, a term he used that upset a lot of people, to the racism, the misogynistic accusations. Ultimately, he is a Prime Minister who serves the entire country. So how does he do that? How does he extend that olive branch once this is all said and done?
It's going to be extraordinarily difficult for him because he has used very divisive language. And going back to Monday's press conference, it was interesting to see that the meat and potatoes of that press conference was left to Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland. She gave all the technical details about seizing bank accounts and going after the insurance policies and the like. She had the key role. He gave a long enumeration, a list of things that was not included in the Emergencies Act. We're not suspending the Charter of Rights. We're not doing this. We're not doing that, which was ironic because, of course, the problem is that he's not been doing anything for the past 2 weeks. So what we had again today was Chrystia Freeland front and center. My conclusion from that, and it's been the same that I've been saying since the election, Mr. Trudeau's heart is no longer in it. He's preparing to hand off to Chrystia Freeland. There'll have to be a race. Other people will run. But it's quite clear for me, if you look at the 5 parties present in the House of Commons, the only one of those 5 parties that's never had a woman leader is the Liberal Party of Canada. Mr. Trudeau styles himself as a feminist. He's going to do the best he can to make sure the next leader of his party would be Chrystia Freeland, and she would become only the second woman prime minister in Canadian history. It's clear to me that Mr. Trudeau is preparing his exit.
Okay. And in terms of the Emergency Act being necessary, that's what the debate is all about. And of course, these people in power will be judged, each of the MPPs, or I should say the federal Liberals. Thank you so much, Tom Mulcair, who is a CTV political commentator and former NDP leader. In the middle, we have Seamus Murphy, a Liberal strategist with Council Public Affairs, and he's to the right there, and Jamie Ellerton, Conservative strategist.
Well, one thing they didn't have a son that was lying in a cold grave.
All right, come on.
And they still didn't hear my cry. Okay. So again, we got a victory today. But it's so many families out there who don't get victories because of people that we have fighting for us.
What's being considered a symbolic victory for civil rights activists in the U.S. today. The 3 white men convicted of killing Ahmaud Arbery were also found guilty of federal hate crimes.
And this comes one day before the 2nd anniversary of Arbery's death, and confirms that the unarmed man was chased and killed because he was black. To discuss the impact of this verdict, we welcome to CP24 Tonight criminal defense lawyer Ari Goldkind and Sandy Hudson, co-founder of BLM Canada. Thanks to both of you. Ari, did you expect this verdict? I mean, how hard is it to prove a crime is hate motivated? And what did you make of the defense's argument that this was taken out of context?
Chanel, it's been very difficult in the United States, particularly when it comes to these kinds of prosecutions, for prosecutors to succeed. These charges are actually very rarely brought. Here, there was even a plea deal about a month ago that the judge rejected, where they would get 30 years in a federal prison, which is a bit easier of time, and the judge rejected it. I am not surprised by this verdict. Remember, this jury would know that they were convicted at the state level. They're sentenced to life in jail with no chance of parole, but for Mr. Bryan, the person who videoed it. Given the racial epithets, given the horrible words these men were found to be on tape using that were played, that would be fatal to a jury. That's not the end of it. It also has to come into play on that day. The jury obviously believed if this was a white man jogging through that area, there's no chance they would have chased him and killed him. And the third component here, which did not surprise me that a jury would have a huge amount of difficulty with, and hasn't gotten a lot of press attention, quite frankly, is that after they shot him, they left him on the ground to bleed out. They did not render any aid, and that sort of resembles the George Floyd matter that is also familiar, that they didn't seem to care about helping him at all after they shot him.
Sandy, were you surprised?
It's hard to put into words what the emotion is. I am studying law in the United States, and so have an opportunity to go over these sorts of cases. And so I do agree with Mr. Goldkind that it is quite rare that these sorts of prosecutions are successful. But I also know that typically when there is a groundswell of support from the public for the elimination of anti-Black racism, or support for a family who's experienced this sort of horrendous experience, that the courts are influenced by that, even if they typically want to suggest that they're not. And so surprised, not too surprised, but I think what I am, the emotion that really characterizes what I'm feeling right now is we keep doing this piecemeal, one by one. These experiences that these families have, that members of our community have, they're dealt with as they come up, and only the ones that we hear of. There's so many other incidents that we don't hear of, and that keep coming up. And at some point, we're going to need to deal with these things proactively.
And to your point, Sandy, the evidence in this case showed very explicit, blatant racism, but that's not always what racial bias looks like, right?
That's right. And I think with what's happening in the United States right now, a context where books about race are being banned, school boards are talking about banning the teaching of history that discusses race. I mean, that's a context that supports men like the folks who killed Ahmaud Arbery and the actions that they take. And it supports them thinking that the way that they think about Black people is justified and okay. And it then further supports the actions that they take against us out in public.
So, Ari, how far-reaching could the impact of this hate crime conviction go in America? Could it deter racist people from committing crimes?
Well, that's a tough question because deterrence is in of itself a sort of fragile concept as to whether people learn from the news or other things. Certainly, there may be a deterrent effect. We've certainly seen that in various elements of police who are less likely and less willing to get involved in certain things for fear of being caught. However, if you look at this at the top federal level, Merrick Garland, the head law enforcement person in the Biden presidency, he has made it very clear that there is no priority that is more important to him than these kinds of civil rights prosecutions. If you look at the actual percentages of the number of cases that have been brought in history, it's extraordinarily low. He is ramping those up in a very, very significant way. And given that we now have cell phone video, we have recordings, look at this case where they played all of these horrible epithets that these men used not on the day in question, which is what their lawyers pointed out, but what their motivation was. Remember, we're talking about federal hate crimes prosecutions that really goes to motive, why they did this on that day versus the state crime level. I do think this will make a very significant difference. It will allow prosecutors throughout the United States to know these cases are not flyers anymore. You can have white juries. This was a predominantly white jury, about 7 or 8 white jurors, 3 Black people, 1 Hispanic person. We're now seeing the white juries, even in the case of the George Floyd hate crime prosecution right now is predominantly white. White jurors are not afraid to convict at this point. And to me, the other point is that it leads to change in the community. Let's not forget Brunswick, Georgia. This has led to a new Black police chief. It's led to the prosecutor who had some weird backroom dealing with these brothers. She was turfed and indicted. So it's not just the conviction of the McMichaels that are interesting, but it's all the spill out effects that are intended to make the system more accountable to all people it serves, not just one group of people.
So when we talk about accountability, Sandy, what does this mean for the Black Lives Matter movement here in Canada? I mean, does this verdict today just confirm what every Black person knew all along?
Yeah, I think these sorts of verdicts are, again, rare. I think I differ from Mr. Goldkind in my analysis there. I think if we take a look at the body of cases in the United States, like this sort of an outcome is rare, and I don't think that it ultimately deters people. And of course, state to state, it's different. And so for us in Canada, what does it mean? It is just a continuation of the sort of work that we need to do, because even though this verdict is a conviction of a hate crime, what does that do for Ahmaud Arbery's family, who has lost a member of their family? And what does that do to prevent the next one? Again, the body of cases suggests that it doesn't do much. And so I think that what we need is a cultural shift. And the courts are a very, very small part of that and are not going to provide that for us. We, as community members and people involved in our communities, have to create that ourselves.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about the justice system here at home. Ari, talk about how Canada's criminal code addresses hate crimes or doesn't, whether you think we need more specific sections to address crimes like this here in our country.
Well, there's 2 prongs to that. One, just going back to Ms. Hudson's point, we actually don't disagree. The numbers are that these successful prosecutions are rare. And my point is that these prosecutions are rarely brought. and therefore rarely likely to succeed. That is now starting to change under Merrick Garland in the Biden administration. So that is something that we are seeing significant change, obviously, again, post George Floyd, which has changed the world in earth-shattering ways. Hate crimes, or the word hate in Canada, is the very different thing here. The word hate is often used in a whole number of ways, often not as racial or as specific as it is in the United States when it comes to what is called anti-Black racism. Here it is more advocating genocide, hate for a particular group, not necessarily the same group that we're talking about for Mr. Arbery. We may not, and again, I'll defer to your next guest, to Ms. Hudson as well. In Canada, the situation is probably quite a bit different than in Brunswick, Georgia. I'm sure some people would say not, but in Canada and the Canadian courts, there have been very significant moves, including a very significant decision to lawyers out of the Ontario Superior Court in Toronto that is really meant to address racism and anti-Black racism in our criminal courts. And there is no practitioner right now in the criminal justice system who isn't extraordinarily aware of that decision and its impact.
All right, Ari Goldkind and Sandy Hudson, we have to leave this discussion here. Thank you both for making time to speak about this significant moment. We appreciate it.
Ukrainian lawmakers declaring a national state of emergency today after Russian President Vladimir Putin received authorization to use military force outside his country. On Monday, Putin signed decrees recognizing the independence of rebel regions in eastern Ukraine and later sanctioned the deployment of Russian troops there to, quote, maintain peace.
The West hit back with sanctions, but is it enough? For more on the stunning developments and Canada's response, we're joined tonight by former Foreign Affairs Minister and former Defence Minister Peter MacKay, who served under Stephen Harper. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. Lots to talk about. We'll begin with breaking news in this country. A different tune from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He is now revoking the Emergencies Act. He says the situation is no longer an emergency. Can I start by asking you what you make of this?
Well, it's a bit ironic that it happened on a day like today, as you've described the Emergency Act in Ukraine being invoked, virtually surrounded, 150,000 Russian troops at the ready, seemingly an imminent attack coming with heavy artillery and tanks. And not to diminish what happened in Ottawa, but that is what a real emergency looks like in Ukraine. And so, yes, I think it was the right decision. It arguably wasn't an emergency in the first place. And the police at our borders, the police in Ottawa, were able to do their job really without any additional powers necessary. Now, the financial elements and other aspects that are found in that legislation also being revoked. And hopefully this will allow us now to move forward and focus on other matters including our economy and what could very well be a war that may outbreak very soon in Ukraine, and what, if any, role Canada will play.
So was the problem in Ottawa policing then? Was the Emergencies Act unnecessary?
Well, I think just the threat or the prospect of the Emergency Act maybe emboldened the police in Ottawa, but there was nothing there that they couldn't have done before that was found in that legislation. The use of sanctions, more or less financial penalties, those aspects, I think, perhaps had a psychological impact. But as we saw in Alberta, as we saw in other places, the Windsor Bridge, the police were able to effectively do their job. And so that debate is now over, the act being revoked, and now it's on to other things.
Okay. Speaking of sanctions, let's get to the crisis in Ukraine. We know Canada has imposed economic sanctions against Russia, meant to punish Vladimir Putin. We're also sending more troops and military gear to Eastern Europe. But I want to talk about these sanctions. Does Vladimir Putin care about them? Do you think they mean anything to him?
Well, they'll mean something to the Russian people, and I think that is the impact that will be felt. Any further pressure that are placed on oligarchs, people around Vladimir Putin in terms of their assets outside the country, in countries like ours, their inability to travel, the Magnitsky sanctions, to group them in that fashion, the inability to borrow money. The United States, of course, took more severe steps today in terms of the sanctions and the inability of Russia to do business in parts of the world. Yes, I think these impacts will be felt. Russia is a very energy-dependent economy, but they're also a very agrarian country. And so Canada, incidentally, has business ties with Russia that could impact in terms of both equipment, in terms of feed for animals, in terms of seed, all of those aspects, as well as technical equipment that Russia relies on. So the short answer is yes, the sanctions will be felt. Will it deter Vladimir Putin? Probably not. He's a man on a mission. There is a destiny that he has in his eyes that is distorted. He has obviously played a very dangerous game of cat and mouse with the diplomatic community, and it seems imminent. I've been speaking to a lot of people, including some who are on the ground in Ukraine. The people there are very resilient, poised for what may happen. The question seems to be not if, but when, and from what direction. They are virtually surrounded, and as we know, they lost a big part of their country in Crimea, the last invasion from Russia in 2014.
Mm-hmm. Mr. McKay, how would you characterize President Putin's actions? Does any of this surprise you?
I describe it as completely irresponsible and irreverent. He has been an unstable leader in that country for many years now, and obviously changed his own constitution to stay beyond what would normally be allowed under Russian law. I've met Vladimir Putin. He's a very chilling, sociopathic individual. He seems to exude a confidence and a self-assuredness that we see on display. He also has no difficulty in disinformation, misinformation, bending the truth to the breaking point, as he was entertaining a parade of diplomats in Moscow at the Kremlin, and firmly denying that this was anything more than military exercises and that they were, in fact, just a few days ago pulling troops away from the border, none of which was true. And so he's a very dangerous individual who feels it is his destiny to behave like a czar and in many ways try to recreate the Soviet Union. This is part of his plan.
So what's the best strategy in this scenario when you're dealing with someone, like you said, sociopathic individual, dangerous person? What, if anything, could deter him at this point in time?
Well, there's very little. I think we should have started with these sanctions some time ago. We should have started putting penalties in place for he and his regime, members of his government, so to speak. Just as, and I'm not drawing any analogies here, there was preparation that could have been done in anticipation of what happened in Ottawa. We could have put, concrete barriers to prevent trucks from pulling up in front of the Parliament buildings. And so the things, it doesn't pay now, I suppose, to do much of a retrospective, but there is now, I believe, it is incumbent upon our countries to pull together, to work in unison. There has to be very real efforts to support Ukraine in any way that we can. We have sent troops, as you mentioned earlier. Equipment, including lethal equipment, has now arrived in Ukraine, some from Canada. But they're in need of heavy armament. They're in need of armor-piercing equipment. They're in need of more support in terms of tanks and heavy machinery that will at least protect to some degree the barrage that will be coming. Ukraine is very, very outnumbered and outgunned in terms of what Russia is mounting at their border at this time. And look, one last point, diplomatically, we saw, you played a clip from the United Nations today, the Ukrainian foreign minister. There have been a lot of words being spoken, but actions like kicking Russia out of the UN Security Council, as we did with the G8. We removed them. These are the type of real sanctions that bite, and go to the heart of perhaps the ego of Vladimir Putin.
So when we think about international relations and diplomacy, why do you think the West hesitated in its response?
It's hard to say, because I think this has been on a slow boil now for a long time, arguably since before 2014, when they went into Crimea. And look, I have to say, it won't stop at Ukraine. There are other former Soviet satellite countries, Poland, the Balkans, Georgia, Belarus. This is, I believe, part, again, of a larger intention that Vladimir Putin has. And the West, NATO countries, European Union in particular, are in a very precarious position now, not just geographically. We heard the former president of Russia, Medvedev, speak just this week about turning off Russian gas to Germany and European countries, and they should prepare to pay $2,000 for a cubic foot of gas. Well, again, it's purely retrospective, but if Canada had been a producer in large part of liquefied natural gas that could have fed the European market, this wouldn't be as pernicious and as damaging to the European economy as it will be now. But that ship has sailed, pardon the pun, and we don't have LNG leaving our shores destined for European ports.
You may not have the answer to this, but how much time do you think Ukraine has here? And if you were Vladimir Zelensky, what would you be doing tonight?
Well, fortifying to the greatest extent possible. I think, and I could be completely wrong, but this could be hours, wow, as opposed to days or weeks, from what I'm hearing. And the posture that the Russians have at the border can only last for so long. But they have medical personnel and tents in addition to the military might that they have accumulated at the border. The question, as I mentioned earlier, about what approach the Russian army may take if it comes through Belarus. This is much closer to Kiev, the capital, but it is more likely to come from the east, the Luhansk area, and the Donbass region, so to speak, those breakaway or independent states that Russia recognized this week. Again, very provocative, breaking UN constitutional requirements, as well as the Minsk agreement. All of this is out the window. And so Zelensky, made the remark not that long ago when Vladimir Putin, as part of his disinformation discussion, said, Ukraine and Russia are brothers. And Zelensky, who is a comedian and known for his humor, said, yes, Cain and Abel. And so there is I think, an acceptance of almost an inevitability. And yet Ukrainian people are extremely resilient. They have suffered this hot breath of Russia down the back of their neck from the moment that they declared independence. And Canada is and remains a strong friend and ally. There's 1.3 million Canadians of Ukrainian descent. We were the first country to recognize them under Brian Mulroney. And it was obvious from the outset that Ukraine was looking to countries like Canada to show leadership. And we have stepped up, to be fair. It's been measured, it's been staged, but I suspect strongly we will have to do more. And the government seems to be signaling a willingness to do more.
Okay, Canada will have to do more. We'll have to leave it there. Former Defense Minister Peter MacKay, it's been so great to get your perspective. Thanks so much for joining us here on CP24 Tonight.
Thank you.
Pleasure to speak to you both.
With the threat of war breaking out in Europe, stock markets around the world are responding to the uncertainty surrounding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Crude oil prices surged 7.5% to more than $100 a barrel for the first time since 2014.
And with the concerns of a prolonged crisis in Eastern Europe that could disrupt Russian supplies of crude oil, what does that mean for global markets and for investors? Well, with more on this, let's bring in Brian Borzakowski, business journalist and founder of All Caps Content. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. You know, I don't normally watch the Russian stock market, but the MOEX plummeted at one point nearly 50%. I think it was down about 33% at the end of the day, wiping out about $150 billion in value. What do you think the repercussions of this prolonged war could have, not only overseas, but specifically for North American markets?
Well, I mean, I'll say the Russian stock market really doesn't have much of an impact on the global markets, doesn't have much of an impact on people watching this. The Russian market is very concentrated in oil stocks. It's a much smaller market than the American market. So I wouldn't read too much into that, although clearly investors in Russia don't like what's going on right now. So that's one thing, to take from that. Global markets actually were up at the end of the day. So they did fall, like when markets opened, fell about 2%, and they were up. The S&P 500 is up by 1.5%. The NASDAQ was up by about 3%, and Canada's market was up slightly, but it was still in the black. So I think investors should just, be careful, don't panic, but there could likely be volatility in the weeks and, ahead. Just one thing is that, war typically doesn't ultimately impact markets too much. There's been research done where they've looked at a whole bunch of different conflicts, and markets were only down by about 1.2% on average between all these conflicts. The Georgia-Russia war, markets were actually up by about 2.3% during that time. So don't panic. It's going to be volatile, but in the end, we have not seen sort of big crashes because of global conflict.
So with that said then, Brian, as someone who knows absolutely nothing about the stock market and economics, it just goes right over here, why should investors, people here in Canada and the U.S., why should we care? Why should we be watching what's happening over there when it comes to our own pocketbooks?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, Russia is a big energy and oil market. So when there's always conflict or anything really happens when it comes to oil, we see oil prices spike. So we could see in the coming days any little bit of news coming out of there, oil prices could rise. We saw, West Texas Intermediate crude, which is sort of the main North American oil price, about $95. Brent crude, which is overseas, topped over 100. Now that could impact gas prices. So that can impact our pocketbook if we see a sustained rise in oil prices. And so that's something to consider. It's just, and nobody just likes uncertainty. That's the other thing. It just makes people nervous. So whether stocks fall or rise, nobody likes uncertainty. So that makes investors nervous. They might start to panic. They shouldn't. But, that's the main thing. But we're also in a time of where the markets are, the economy is coming out of COVID. And it was really up. It's been really up and down. We see inflation rising. So if gas prices rise, we're already kind of hurting with inflation. So that could impact sort of people's overall budgets. So there are economic impacts, but it is taking place, in overseas. It's as bad as it is. The biggest market decline we saw was 9/11 on U.S. soil, and we haven't seen that, which means U.S. companies are going to continue probably doing well, and that's good for investors.
And while Russian markets might not affect a lot what's happening here in North America, but there's no doubt a lot of what happens in China has a trickle effect on economics here in North America. So I'm curious, what do you think China's role in all of this is going to be, and how war in Europe could potentially impact Asian markets?
Well, I think Asian markets will react probably similar ways to the U.S. And Canada markets. I mean, the real question here is how much does this escalate? How involved does China get? Do they become a face of this? Like, they're involved, but they sort of still stay a bit behind the scenes. But where does this go from here? If we see a much bigger invasion, if this takes much longer, some people are very nervous that this could this be the start of a much bigger war in Europe? I don't know. But if that happens, then, and we see kind of China get more involved, I think that'll impact stock markets around the world, not just Asian markets. So that's a bit of the fear. Where does this go? The unknown always spooks investors.
You touched on it a little bit, Brian, gas prices. Certainly, a lot of people have already been seeing, $1.65 almost in parts of the GTA for gas. When you couple that with inflation, a lot of people have been hurting in their banks. So talk about, I guess, how the situation there could impact the price of gas even more, the price of oil even more.
Yeah, generally, you see gas prices rise when oil prices rise. I mean, we've seen oil prices, as you said, gas prices have climbed over the last while because oil prices have risen. And so that will impact people's pocketbooks for sure. And what happens, in Russia, it's supply. If the supply gets somehow ruined, if Russia decides, we don't want to actually share any of our oil, and, especially also natural gas. Europe is the largest importer of natural gas in the world. 41% of their gas comes from Russia. So if Russia decides, I'm going to play hardball and cut off, those taps, then that will impact natural gas prices, which could impact, heating our homes, heating our office buildings, and that sort of thing. We have our own gas here, so we might not be affected, but all these things are globally connected. And the same thing in oil. If they decide to do something where they're not, sending oil to other places, they're a big oil producer, then that will impact oil prices around the world. So that's, I think, the big thing. So far, we're not seeing any of that, but that, again, is an unknown as where that goes.
And Brian, circling back to some advice for retail investors, the average investor out there. I mean, right out of the gates this morning, we saw most North American markets get a little bit spooked by what happened, but they had a nice recovery and a nice rebound by the end of the day. Many of them, up about anywhere from 1% to about 3%. But what do you think? Just moving forward, the average retail investor, how they should react to some of this uncertainty. That investors don't like uncertainty, and right now what's happening in Europe is obviously causing some great concern. What are your thoughts on that?
It's easy to panic. We are a bit shell-shocked from the last 2 years. The economy's been up and down. So people are sort of, I think, generally a little bit nervous about their stocks and their portfolios. But stocks have been doing really well. This year, not as well. But you just got to stay the course. It's probably going to be volatile. You'll have some down days. You'll have some up days. But based on history, these conflicts don't seem to sink the market in a major way. Just remember that. Think the long term, your retirement planning. A lot of people are 10, 20, 30, 10 years, in the future, till they need that money. This conflict will probably be over by then.
Brian Borzakowski, we appreciate your time and perspective. Thank you.
With the eyes of the world watching the unfolding situation in Ukraine, pressure is now mounting on Western leaders to form a united response to the attacks and invasion by Russia's military. NATO's Secretary General has called for an emergency summit tomorrow. Meanwhile, Russian forces continue to press forward into Ukrainian territory, launching numerous attacks on military bases, and even a residential building in Kharkov was shelled.
And Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky also responded to reports of Russian forces taking control of the Chernobyl nuclear plant as a declaration of war against the whole of Europe. With more reaction to the military operation underway and the threat of the largest military conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War, let's bring in retired Major General David Fraser. Thank you so much for joining us on CP24 tonight. Major General, you served as a Brigadier General in Afghanistan, where you commanded thousands of NATO troops. I'm curious, what's going through your mind right now as Ukrainian forces are facing the threat of a full-blown invasion by Russian troops?
Well, first of all, it's just a tragedy, and it's a travesty of law and order, and for the Ukrainian people who have done absolutely nothing to suffer this at the hands of Russians. But for the Ukrainian security forces, they've watched for weeks now as the Russians got ready to invade their country. And what we see here today and starting last night was actually a highly coordinated, highly trained, sophisticated attack from 3 different directions, including the air by the Russians. And this, again, is unprecedented. We trained for this during the Cold War when I was in the military, but never in my life did I ever expect to see it come to fruition. And we are watching it on TV right now. The Russians are overwhelmingly all in on this invasion, and the Ukrainian forces, as much as they have the desire to defend their country, they are heavily outmanned and outgunned on this one. And this really has a really poor and tragic ending for Ukraine.
Major General, talk about the planning that goes into this, because it was just yesterday Vladimir Putin appeared on state media saying that they were launching military exercises. Judging by what you're saying, a lot of thought, a lot of pre-planning, a lot of training needs to go into this to be in these positions ready to go as soon as that message dropped on TV, essentially.
Beatrice, this wasn't just planned in the last couple of weeks. This was actually planned for months, if not years. Putin has spent a lot of time making sure he has a battle chest of over $60 billion. He has thought about every move and counter move that the West has had. He has had a deception plan against us with misinformation about creating a false humanitarian crisis in the eastern provinces, saying that there was diplomatic opportunities when there were none, lying to the president. In fact, up to the point where the Security Council was meeting last night, at the same time, the Russians were actually coming across the border and invading. So this has been planned. This has been rehearsed. This is nothing more than an absolute deliberate assault on Europe. And we have never seen anything like this since the Second World War. Most of us weren't even around then. This is huge in the way of planning and execution. And you want to talk about shock and awe, this is truly shock and awe done by the Russians.
And speaking of shock and awe, Major General, the world is watching right now. We're watching this play out in real time. And I'm sure the world is also eagerly anticipating what kind of reaction, along with sanctions, is there going to be, especially from NATO? Will there be military reaction? What are you anticipating? What do you think would be the appropriate response by NATO members?
Well, up until, yesterday, I thought the Ukrainian president had done a good job in not biting on any of the bait that the Russians were giving him. At the same time, President Biden and, President Macron and others were doing a great job of showing all the intelligence they had to prepare us for ultimately what we're seeing right now. So they understood what the intent was. and so what has happened now is the Russians are all in. They have got 3 attacks going off in every direction from the north, the east, and the south. And, we are putting in sanctions. I think we have to double down and put a lot more sanctions where it's going to be painful for the Russians, including going after Belarus, going after China, so there's no backdoor, and also then bolstering up NATO, which is already starting to happen now, that saying you cannot come outside of the confines of Ukraine, because if you do, this is, quote unquote, going to be a world war.
Yeah, Ukraine not a NATO member, and at this point, NATO has given no indication that it plans to have boots on the ground in Ukraine. I guess, what is the obligation, Major General? Are they kind of sitting and watching for that, so to speak, red line for Putin to surpass it before they decide their next step and possibly to add these troops?
Every nation has been very clear that they are not sending troops into Ukraine. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. They've had so much corruption since they left the Soviet Union that they have not been admitted, and everyone's been very clear about it. But the NATO troops, including Canada, have been providing lethal aids, humanitarian aid, and whatever we can give them other than troops on the ground. And so what is going to happen next is it's going to be up to the Ukrainians to defend themselves if they can. And all those other NATO border countries that border onto Ukraine and Russia and Belarus, they will be bolstering their defensive mechanisms. And there's a very different thing. If any Russian crosses that border, either physically or metaphysically, there will be as the president said, a very immediate and severe response.
Major General, I'm curious about what you think in regards to the timing of this, because let's face it, Putin has had his sights set on Ukraine for years, annexed Crimea back in 2014. And I'm wondering what you think might have emboldened the Russian leader. And I'm wondering if you think anything has to do with their alliance with the Chinese, with Iran, or possibly if he feels more emboldened after the fall of Afghanistan to Taliban terrorists last summer without any major resistance from Western allies.
I think, Jamie, all those things you just mentioned were factors into his decision. The timing is because it's wintertime, it's solid, it's easier for armored vehicles to go across the country. If you look at, unfortunately, history, Operation Barbarossa, a lot of the routes that they're taking are the same routes that were used before. And the other thing, too, is that this is an operation that he has been planning since he took over leadership of Russia. This doesn't go back to 2014. It goes back to 2008 when he went into Georgia. He's been building his forces, and the Minsk agreement and seems to have really gotten under his skin. And this is a different Putin, whereas before he was working selectively, cooperatively with us. But now he's not listening to anyone. But this has been years in the making. And we may even go way back about the demise of the Soviet Union and whether or not the seeds were sown there when he was a KGB officer.
And now it appears he wants to build the Soviet Union once again. Major General David Fraser, thanks so much for your time and your analysis tonight.